Antiseptic always smells like cowardice to her now. It covers up the rotting truth of a dying body, pretending everything is clean and controlled. They wanted her gone because she didn't smile at the charting desk. They thought she was just a broken civilian. They were wrong on both counts. Fluorescent lights hummed an irregular, teeth-grinding pitch over triage station 4. Kaelin rubbed the bridge of her nose. Her fingers were slick with cheap pink institutional hand soap that never quite rinsed off, leaving a tacky film on her knuckles. Memorial Hospital demanded spotless hands, spotless uniforms, and spotless attitudes. Kaelin only ever managed the first. She stared at the electronic charting system on the monitor. The cursor blinked. A mocking, rhythmic pulse. Patient presents with mild abdominal discomfort. Pain scale, 4/10. Kaelin typed the words mechanically. Her jaw ached from clenching it for the last 6 hours. You missed the secondary billing code on the Jenkins chart. The voice was pitched perfectly to cut through the low murmur of the emergency department. Kaelin didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head. Diane Lipton stood there, clutching a clipboard against her chest like a shield. Diane was the charge nurse. She wore scrubs that somehow never wrinkled, smelling faintly of synthetic vanilla and hairspray, a cloying, suffocating cloud that made Kaelin's throat tight. I noted the laceration length and the suture count, Kaelin said. Her voice was flat. She didn't have the energy to infuse it with the deferential warmth Diane demanded. The bleeding was stopped. That's not the point, Kaelin, Diane sighed. A sharp intake of breath through her nose that signaled deep, patronizing disappointment. We have protocols. The billing department needs the secondary code for the lidocaine. If you don't chart it, the hospital absorbs the cost. You've been here 3 months. You should know this. Kaelin looked at Diane's perfectly manicured fingernails, tapping against the plastic clipboard. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like small caliber brass hitting concrete. Kaelin blinked, forcing the auditory hallucination away. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Understood, Kaelin said. She turned back to the monitor. I'll update the chart. Diane lingered. The vanilla scent thickened. You don't fit in here, do you? Kaelin kept her eyes on the screen. I do my job. You do the physical tasks, Diane corrected, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. But you don't talk to the girls in the break room. You don't participate in the shift change potlucks. When a patient cries, you just stare at them. You lack empathy, Kaelin. And in civilian nursing, empathy is just as important as a sterile field. Kaelin's chest tightened, a brief, sharp spasm of defensive anger. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to ask Diane what empathy looked like when a 19-year-old was missing the lower half of his body and begging for his mother. Did empathy mean crying with him? Or did it mean tying off his femoral artery so he could survive long enough to realize his life was over? Instead, Kaelin said nothing. She clicked the mouse. She updated the billing code. Diane scoffed quietly and walked away, her rubber-soled clogs squeaking softly against the linoleum. Kaelin leaned back in her plastic chair. It creaked under her weight. She felt a profound, exhausting apathy settling into her bones. She had taken this job because her VA counselor told her she needed routine. Civilian life requires structure, Kaelin. You need to transition your skills. So, she traded a Kevlar vest for teal scrubs. She traded dirt, the metallic tang of torn veins, and the deafening roar of rotor wash for the sterile, suffocating bureaucracy of a suburban emergency room. She hated it, but she hated herself more for missing the chaos. There was a terrifying simplicity to combat trauma. You either fixed the leak or the patient died. There were no billing codes. There were no customer service surveys. Hey, a crumpled packet of graham crackers landed on the keyboard in front of her. Kaelin looked up. Tom, one of the younger ER techs, offered a weak, sympathetic smile. Don't let her get to you, Tom muttered, leaning against the counter. Diane's just mad because you start IVs better than she does. She took 3 sticks on a dehydrated geriatric yesterday. You got it in 1. Kaelin picked up the crackers. The cellophane crinkled. It's just a vein, Tom. It's basic plumbing. Not to her. To her, it's a hierarchy. Tom glanced nervously toward the hallway where Diane had vanished. Just watch your back, okay? She's been pulling your employment file. I heard her complaining to HR that you're insubordinate and culturally incompatible. Kaelin ripped open the crackers. They were stale. They tasted like cardboard and dust. Let her complain. But a cold knot formed in Kaelin's stomach. She needed this job. Not for the money her disability checks covered her rent, but for her own sanity. If she didn't have a place to go for 12 hours a day, the silence in her apartment would crush her. She knew she was hanging by a thread. She just didn't realize how quickly Diane was holding the scissors. Midnight brought the storm. It wasn't rain, but a chaotic influx of shattered metal and broken bodies. A multi-vehicle pileup on Interstate 95, involving a commercial bus and 3 sedans. The double doors of the ambulance bay blew open. The harsh wail of sirens outside bled into the sterile air of the ER, bringing with it the smell of ozone, burnt rubber, and raw copper. Suddenly, Memorial Hospital's pristine protocol dissolved. Paramedics rushed stretchers through the doors, shouting vitals over the din. Nurses who usually spent 20 minutes adjusting IV lines were running in circles, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Diane was standing near the center desk, pointing and shouting directions that were instantly swallowed by the noise. Kaelin felt a physical shift. It was a subtle, internal click. The exhaustion that had weighed her down all night evaporated. Her pulse slowed. The chaotic noise of the room separated into distinct, manageable data points. The beep of a crashing monitor, the wet, gurgling cough of a patient in Bay 2, the sharp, frantic voice of Dr. Evans, the lone attending physician, screaming for intubation equipment. She walked briskly past Diane, ignoring the charge nurse's frantic waving. Kaelin moved toward Bay 4. A paramedic was transferring a man onto the hospital bed. John Doe, mid-40s, the medic barked, out of breath, his uniform stained dark brown. Unrestrained driver. Hit the steering column. BP is tanking, 70/40. Heart rate, 140. Trachea is deviating to the left. Kaelin stepped up to the bed. The man's skin was the color of old cement, clammy and terrifyingly cold to the touch. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow jerks, but only the left side was rising. The right side was rigid, swollen. Tension, pneumothorax. Air was trapped in his chest cavity, crushing his right lung and pushing his heart out of alignment. His veins were failing. He was suffocating from the inside out. "Where is Evans?" Kaelin demanded, her voice cutting through the noise with flat, heavy authority. "Intubating a head trauma in Bay 1. A junior nurse panicked from across the room. "He said he'll be here in 5 minutes. "He doesn't have 5 minutes. He doesn't have 2, Kaelin said. She looked at the man's neck. The jugular vein was bulging, thick and blue against his pale skin. Kaelin turned to the crash cart. She yanked open the top drawer. The metal tracks screeched. She bypassed the standard dressing kits and grabbed a large-bore IV catheter, a 1/4 gauge needle. It was thick, brutal, and meant for pushing massive fluids, not for what she was about to do. "What are you doing?" Diane's voice snapped behind her. The charge nurse had finally made her way to Bay 4, her eyes wide as she saw Kaelin tearing open the sterile packaging of the massive needle. "He needs a dart," Kaelin said, not looking up. She grabbed a bottle of betadine and splashed it ruthlessly across the man's right chest. The dark orange liquid ran down his ribs, pooling on the white sheets. "You can't do that," Diane shrieked, stepping forward, her hand reaching out to grab Kaelin's wrist. "That is a physician-level procedure. You are a registered nurse, Hayes. You are stepping out of your scope of practice." Kaelin froze for a fraction of a second. The institutional conditioning clawed at her brain. Loss of license, lawsuit, termination. Then she looked down at the patient. His lips were turning a dark, bruised purple. His eyes rolled back. His chest stopped heaving. The monitor shrieked a sustained, flatline tone. He was coding. "Back off, Diane," Kaelin growled. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the lethal edge in it made the charge nurse physically recoil. Kaelin found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't hesitate. She drove the 1-4 gauge needle directly into the man's chest wall. Hiss. It was a sharp, distinct sound, like a punctured tire. A sudden rush of trapped air escaped through the catheter. Blood bubbled at the plastic hub. Instantly, the man's chest dropped. The pressure on his heart released. On the monitor, the chaotic squiggles organized. A jagged, weak rhythm returned. Beep, beep, beep. His color didn't return to normal, but the deadly purple receded from his lips. Kaelin pulled the sharp stylet out, leaving the flexible plastic catheter in place to keep the airway open. Her hands were perfectly steady. She taped it down with quick, aggressive tears of medical tape. Dr. Evans ran into the bay, his scrubs splattered, holding a scalpel and a chest tube kit. He stopped, panting, looking at the patient, the monitor, and then at the makeshift decompression needle sticking out of the man's chest. "Who did this?" Evans asked, his chest heaving. "I did," Kaelin said. She stepped back, wiping a smear of betadine off her wrist with the back of her hand. Evans stared at her, then looked at the monitor. "You saved his life." He moved in to insert the permanent chest tube. "Good catch. Prep him for surgery." Kaelin nodded, reaching for a fresh pair of gloves. But before she could snap them on, Diane stepped directly into her path. The charge nurse's face was mottled red with fury. Her jaw was trembling. "My office. Now," Diane hissed. "We have mass casualties," Kaelin pointed out, gesturing to the overflowing bays. "I said now." "Kaelin," Diane's voice cracked, loud enough that a few paramedics turned to look. "You just performed an unauthorized surgical intervention. You are a liability. Walk away from the patient." Kaelin looked at Diane. She saw the fear in the woman's eyes, not fear for the patient, but fear of a broken rule. Fear of losing control of her pristine environment. The adrenaline drained from Kaelin's system in a sudden, sickening rush. Her knees felt hollow. Her hands finally began to shake, a tiny, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers. She wasn't a hero. She was just an idiot who couldn't stop fighting a war that was already over. She had broken the cardinal rule of civilian life. Let the system handle it, even if the system fails. Kaelin stripped off her gloves. They snapped loudly in the quiet bubble of tension between them. She tossed them into the biohazard bin. 10 minutes later, she was standing in the cramped, windowless locker room. The smell of old sneakers and stale peppermint hung in the air. She pulled her civilian clothes from the narrow metal locker. A faded gray hoodie, denim jeans. She had been suspended immediately, pending a formal termination hearing in the morning. Diane had made it clear security would escort her out if she didn't leave willingly. Kaelin shoved her stethoscope into her duffel bag. The metal bell clinked against a carabiner. She zipped the bag shut with a sharp, violent tug. She felt a profound emptiness, a void where her purpose used to be. She had saved a life, and it had cost her the only anchor she had left. As she walked out the back exit, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind her, the cool night air hit her face. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like an eviction. Sunlight crept through the bent slats of Kaelin's living room blinds, slicing across the faded rug in harsh, dusty angles. Morning felt like an insult. Her eyes burned. She had spent the last 8 hours sitting on her thrift store sofa, staring at the muted television screen, a lukewarm mug of instant coffee resting on her knee. It tasted of burnt tin and old water. Termination was scheduled for 10 o'clock. HR called it a disciplinary review, but Kaelin knew the military-grade euphemism for a firing squad when she heard one. She showered in water that wouldn't get hot enough, shivering as she scrubbed the faint, phantom smell of betadine from her cuticles. She pulled on a plain black sweater and gray slacks. Civilian armor. It felt loose and flimsy compared to a uniform, lacking the comforting weight of utility belts and radio harnesses. Memorial Hospital's administrative wing smelled entirely different from the clinical floors. Down here, there was no bleach. There was no metallic tang of illness. It smelled of ozone from the heavy-duty copiers, roasted hazelnut coffee, and expensive floral perfumes. It was a sterile vacuum where decisions about human lives were made on spreadsheets. Kaelin sat in a leather-backed chair that hissed softly as it absorbed her weight. Across the heavy oak desk sat Janet, the Director of Human Resources. Janet wore a beige cardigan and a sympathetic, highly practiced frown. Diane sat to Janet's right, her posture rigid, a thick manila folder resting squarely in front of her. "Kaelin," Janet started, her voice coated in professional molasses. "We appreciate you coming in. We know last night was highly stressful for everyone." Silence stretched. Kaelin looked at a small framed motivational poster behind Janet's head, a cartoon frog hanging from a branch. "Hang in there." Kaelin felt a dull ache behind her temples. "I'm here," Kaelin said, her voice rasped slightly from disuse. "Let's get straight to it," Diane interrupted. She didn't have Janet's patience for corporate foreplay. "You performed a needle thoracostomy on a patient. You bypassed a physician. You bypassed protocol. You used equipment you were not authorized to handle." "I kept him breathing," Kaelin replied. Her tone was completely neutral. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't lean forward. She just existed in the chair, absorbing the hostility. "You created a massive liability," Janet corrected gently, placing a hand over her own heart as if physically pained by the thought. "If that man had died, Kaelin, the lawsuit would have bankrupted this department. Dr. Evans reported that your intervention was, quote, medically sound in a combat theater, but entirely inappropriate for a registered nurse in an American hospital." A small, bitter smile ghosted across Kaelin's lips. Of course Evans threw her under the bus. In the Bay, he was grateful she had saved him from a dead patient on his shift. In the cold light of day, protecting his medical license meant condemning her actions. "He was dying," Kaelin stated simply. His trachea was deviated. His pressure was bottomed out. He had less than 60 seconds before his heart stopped from the internal pressure. Protocols exist to maintain order, but when the order is going to kill the patient, you break the protocol. Diane slammed her palm flat against the manila folder. It made a sharp, cracking sound in the quiet office. "This isn't a war zone, Hayes. You do not get to play cowboy. You are a nurse. You take orders. You execute the orders. And you stay in your lane." Kaelin looked at Diane's hand, then up to her face. The charge nurse's eyes were wide, flushed with the intoxicating rush of absolute authority. Kaelin suddenly realized that Diane wasn't angry about the patient's safety. She was angry about the hierarchy. Kaelin had stepped out of the rigid box Diane needed everyone to stay inside. "I'm not playing cowboy, Diane," Kaelin said, her voice dropping lower, vibrating with a quiet, exhausted truth. "I was a Fleet Marine Force corpsman for 8 years. I spent 3 deployments in Kandahar and Helmand. I've decompressed more chests in the back of a shaking medevac helicopter than Dr. Evans will see in his entire career. I know exactly what I did." "That is exactly the problem," Janet interjected, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It was typed. It had a line for a signature at the bottom. "Your military background is aggressive. We thought you could transition, Kaelin. We really did. But your actions show a disregard for the collaborative, physician-led environment we foster here. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately, for gross insubordination and practicing outside your clinical scope." Kaelin looked down at the paper. Termination of employment. 2 syllables. 1 pen stroke. It was so remarkably clean. There was no screaming. There was no shrapnel. Just a piece of paper that told her she was broken and useless in this pristine, polite world. She reached for the pen. Her fingers felt numb. She didn't want to fight anymore. She just wanted to go back to her dark apartment, Lock the door, and sleep until the memories stop gnawing at her. Sign the bottom, and we will escort you to your locker to collect your things, Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. Kaelin uncapped the pen. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed in the carpeted hallway outside. Not the soft squeak of rubber nursing clogs or the click of sensible heels. This was the sharp, authoritative strike of polished leather over hard soles, multiple pairs, moving with synchronized purpose. Voices murmured outside the frosted glass door of the HR office. A receptionist's panicked, high-pitched tone fluttered against a deep, gravelly baritone that Kaelin felt in her sternum. The door handle turned. It didn't open politely. It swung inward with enough force to bounce slightly off the rubber wall stop. Janet gasped, half standing from her chair. Diane whipped her head around, her mouth opening to deliver a scathing reprimand. Kaelin froze, the pen hovering a millimeter above the signature line. She knew that sound. She knew that presence. Her heart, sluggish and heavy a moment ago, slammed violently against her ribs. 3 men filled the small doorway, instantly suffocating the room's corporate atmosphere. 2 were younger, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, wearing the pristine pressed khaki of Navy service uniforms. But it was the man in the center who demanded the oxygen in the room. Commander Gregory O'Rourke wore his service dress blues. The dark navy fabric was immaculate. A heavy rack of ribbons rested over his left breast, a splash of vibrant colors against the dark wool. His hair was iron gray, cropped close to his scalp, and his face was mapped with deep, sun-baked creases that no civilian dermatologist could ever smooth out. He looked exactly as Kaelin remembered him from the dust-choked surgical tent in Helmand. Immovable, terrifying, and entirely unbothered by anyone else's opinion. "Can I help you?" Janet stammered, her corporate poise shattering into 1,000 pieces. "This is a private administrative meeting. You can't just walk in here." O'Rourke ignored her completely. His pale blue eyes swept the room, entirely dismissing Diane before locking onto Kaelin. A tiny, almost imperceptible softening happened around the corners of his mouth. "Lieutenant Hayes," O'Rourke said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that rattled the dying ferns. Kaelin swallowed hard. The institutional programming fought against her muscle memory. She slowly stood up from the chair. "Commander O'Rourke." Diane, recovering her indignation, stood up abruptly. "Excuse me, this woman is an employee of this hospital, and she is currently being terminated. I demand to know who you are and why you are interrupting a confidential HR proceeding." O'Rourke finally turned his head to look at Diane. He didn't blink. He just stared at her with the mild, clinical curiosity of a man examining a mildly irritating insect. "I am Commander O'Rourke, United States Navy Medical Corps," he stated, his tone devoid of any need to impress her. "And you are attempting to fire one of the finest trauma specialists I have ever had the privilege of serving with. She is a rogue nurse who violated our protocols," Diane countered, her voice pitching higher in a desperate bid to maintain control of her territory. "She performed an illegal medical procedure. She saved a man's life," O'Rourke corrected sharply. The casualness vanished. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "A man who happens to be a retired Marine gunnery sergeant. His wife called the base this morning, said a nurse named Hayes saved his life with a field-expedient dart when the civilian doctor couldn't get his act together." I knew exactly which Hayes she was talking about. Kaelin stared at O'Rourke, the patient from last night, the tension pneumothorax, a Marine. The sheer, impossible coincidence of it made her dizzy. "That doesn't matter," Janet pleaded from behind the desk, clutching her beige cardigan. "The law. The law dictates scope of practice based on training and certification," O'Rourke interrupted, stepping fully into the room. The 2 enlisted men behind him stepped inside, closing the door firmly. The click of the latch sounded like a vault sealing shut. O'Rourke reached inside his dark wool jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He dropped it onto the manila folder sitting in front of Diane. Lieutenant Kaelin Hayes did not just change bandages. O'Rourke said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of history. She ran forward triage under active mortar fire. She has operated independently in environments you cannot even conceptualize. Last night, she recognized a lethal complication, and she executed a life-saving intervention flawlessly, because that is what she was trained to do. Diane stared at the envelope. She's just an RN. She is a decorated combat veteran, ma'am, O'Rourke said softly, leaning over the desk so he was eye level with the charge nurse. And she resigned her commission because she believed she had lost her edge. She thought she was broken. He looked back at Kaelin. She was wrong. Kaelin felt a hot, humiliating pressure behind her eyes. She bit the inside of her cheek hard, tasting copper. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of Diane. But the heavy, suffocating knot of uselessness that had lived in her chest for 3 months began to unravel. We don't want her here, Diane spat, crossing her arms defensively. We don't need heroes. We need compliance. Then you have successfully eliminated your problem, O'Rourke said, standing fully upright. He looked at Kaelin. Grab your gear, Hayes. You're done here. I have to sign, Kaelin mumbled, looking down at the termination paper. You don't sign a damn thing, O'Rourke commanded gently. They want to fire you? Let them mail the paperwork. We have a car waiting. The gunny is awake, and he wants to shake the hand of the corpsman who stabbed him in the chest. Kaelin looked at Janet, who was staring at the desk, entirely out of her depth. She looked at Diane, whose face was a mask of pale, impotent fury. They looked small. The entire hospital, the pristine floors, the obsessive charting, the petty break-room politics, it all suddenly shrank into utter insignificance. She picked up her duffel bag from the floor. She didn't look back at the desk. Kaelin walked toward the door. The 2 enlisted men stepped aside, clearing a path for her. O'Rourke fell into step beside her. They walked out of the administrative wing, their boots and shoes echoing against the linoleum. Kaelin expected to feel triumphant. She expected to feel like a victor in some petty revenge fantasy. But she didn't. She just felt incredibly tired, and for the first time in months, deeply, profoundly safe. Sir? Kaelin asked quietly, as they reached the hospital lobby, the automatic glass doors sliding open to reveal the bright, harsh morning sun. Yeah, Hayes? Thanks for the extraction. O'Rourke offered a small, crooked smile, the deep lines around his eyes crinkling. We never leave our people behind, Kaelin, even when they try to hide in the suburbs. She stepped out into the daylight. The air smelled like exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. It wasn't clean. It wasn't sterile. But as she took a deep breath, filling her lungs without restriction, it finally felt like home. If this story struck a nerve or reminded you of the silent battles fought by those who serve, hit that like button. Share this video to support the incredible veterans navigating the hardest transition of all coming home. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a deeply grounded, human story from our channel. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Kaelin's journey.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Williams, the owner and manager of Second Ember Reborn. After watching the video, they pushed the new nurse out, until the Navy came for the combat medic they tried to fire. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was Kaelin's quiet determination. Even when she was criticised, misunderstood, and pushed aside, she stayed focused on what mattered most, helping the patient in front of her. The story reminds us that real experience and character aren't always obvious on the surface. One lesson I took from this story is that doing the right thing isn't always the easiest choice, especially when it comes with personal consequences. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew the right thing to do, even if others disagreed? And what moment in Kaelin's journey stood out to you the most? If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these nurse-centered stories, feel free to like or subscribe for more.